The sky burned and the orbital defense grid fell in less than an hour. They came from the dark expecting a slaughter. They looked at our flesh, our fragile bones, and our primitive projectile weapons, and calculated a 3-day conquest. They didn't factor in the mud. They didn't factor in the desperation. And above all, the Armada's supercomputers failed to account for a prehistoric pact made by a campfire 30,000 years ago. They didn't know about the dogs. The rain on the colony world of Jericho didn't fall. It drove hard, stinging like thrown gravel. It mixed with the pulverized rock and the ash of a burning biosphere to create a thick gray sludge that swallowed boots whole. Corporal Thomas Briggs sat at the bottom of a newly blasted crater, his back pressed against a vibrating earth. The ground was shaking. It had been shaking for 3 days. Up above, past the lip of the crater, the sky was a bruised purple, stitched with the bright, silent flashes of dying dreadnoughts. Briggs spat a mouthful of gritty saliva between his boots. He wiped his face with the back of a filthy armored glove. His rifle, a standard-issue magnetic accelerator, rested across his knees. It was a heavy, ugly block of iron and battery packs. It was currently flashing a yellow warning light. Low charge. Next to him, an engine purred. It wasn't a machine. It was breathing. Brutus shifted his weight in the mud. He was 140 pounds of genetically baseline and German Shepherd mix, encased in 40 pounds of ablative combat plating. The armor was scratched, scorched, and caked in the same gray sludge that covered Briggs. A thick collar of titanium and biometric sensors wrapped around the dog's thick neck, linking his vitals directly to the cracked, heads-up display built into Briggs's visor. Brutus whined, a low rumbling sound that vibrated in his chest. He bumped his heavy, blunt snout against Briggs's shoulder. "I know, buddy," Briggs rasped. His throat felt like sandpaper. "I know." Briggs reached up and unlatched his helmet, letting the cold, acidic rain hit his face. He leaned over and pressed his forehead against the dog's armored skull. The metal was cold, but underneath it Briggs could feel the immense, radiant heat of the animal. He smelled wet fur, ozone from the plasma strikes, and the faint, coppery tang of old blood. They had been pushed back 30 miles in 3 days. The hegemony, that was the translation the brass had given the invaders, didn't fight like humans. They didn't fight for territory. They didn't take prisoners. They fought like an immune system clearing a virus. Their ships were elegant silver things that moved with mathematical precision. Their ground troops were tall, bipedal, and encased in seamless white composite armor. They didn't yell. They didn't bleed. When a human railgun slug managed to pierce their kinetic shields and shatter their armor, they simply vented a pale blue gas and collapsed. It made them terrifying. There was no psychology to exploit. You couldn't pin them down with suppressing fire because they didn't experience fear. They simply calculated the trajectory, assessed the kinetic output, and advanced. Briggs rubbed the soft spot behind Brutus's ear, right where the armor met the neural jack. The dog closed his amber eyes and leaned into the touch, letting out a heavy sigh that smelled of synthesized protein paste. For a second, Briggs wasn't in a crater on a dying colony world. He was back in a cramped apartment in Chicago, tossing a tennis ball against a brick wall, watching a clumsy, oversized puppy trip over his own paws. The memory tasted like ash. A sharp burst of static crackled in his earpiece, dragging him back. "All units, this is Captain Hayes." The voice was thin, filtered through layers of electronic interference, but the exhaustion in it was palpable. "They've broken through Sector 4. The heavy armor is gone. Orbital support is gone. They are moving on the primary evacuation center. We have 20,000 civilians still loading onto the dropships." Briggs looked down at his rifle. The yellow light blinked steadily. He had maybe 20 shots left. After that, he had a combat knife. "We are holding the ridge at grid Delta Niner," Hayes continued. "They are bringing up their heavy plasma casters. If they crest that ridge, the dropships are sitting ducks. We hold this line. Do not fall back. Acknowledge." Briggs tapped his comms. Echo Squad acknowledged. Around him, down the length of the scarred trench line, a handful of green confirmation lights flickered on his HUD. There weren't many left. Maybe 200 men and women and 50 hounds. Brutus stood up. The dog knew the tone of the radio chatter. He felt the spike in Briggs's heart rate through the biometric link. The dog's ears swiveled forward, and the fur along his spine, visible through the gaps in the plating, stood on end. A low, continuous growl started in the back of his throat, deep and resonant. "Easy," Briggs whispered, clipping his helmet back into place. The Snort's DHUD booted up, painting the gray world in sharp tactical overlays. Not yet. They were humans. They were messy, fragile, and deeply flawed. They built empires and tore them down out of spite. Out here in the dark, they had found out they were hopelessly outmatched. But they had brought a piece of Earth with them. They had brought the only creatures in the universe foolish enough to love them unconditionally. Briggs checked the quick-release shackle on Brutus's combat harness. "We're going to hold, Brutus," Briggs said, racking the bolt of his rifle. "We're going to hold." Captain Sarah Hayes stood in the center of the subterranean command bunker. The ceiling shook, dusting her shoulders with concrete powder. The tactical table in front of her flickered, rendering the battlefield in ghostly, low-resolution wireframes. She hated the silence of the enemy. On the holomap, the human forces were represented by scattered, pulsing green dots. They were erratic, grouped in messy clusters behind whatever cover they could find. The red dots, the hegemony, moved in perfect geometric formations, a vast, unified phalanx pressing inexorably forward. There were thousands of them. "Captain," said Lieutenant Davis. He was young, his face pale beneath a smear of engine grease. "They're 2 clicks from the ridge. Their forward elements are deploying the casters." "Shield status?" Hayes asked, her voice devoid of inflection. She couldn't afford emotion right now. She had to be a calculator, just like the enemy. "0, Davis replied flatly. "Generators burned out an hour ago. We have infantry barricades and raw earth. That's it." Hayes stared at the map. She knew what those plasma casters did. They didn't blow things up. They superheated the air, turning rock into slag and water into explosive steam. Infantry caught in the blast radius weren't killed. They were instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but blackened shadows burned into the ground. "Our railguns aren't penetrating their forward shields," Davis added, pointing to a cluster of red dots that were absorbing an immense amount of human fire without slowing down. "Their kinetic barriers are too strong." Any projectile moving faster than 100 meters a second is getting deflected. Hayes narrowed her eyes. She leaned over the table, bracing her hands on the metal rim. The hegemony was brilliant. They had analyzed human weaponry within the first hour of the invasion. They saw the humans relied on high-velocity kinetic impacts, bullets, rail-gun slugs, shrapnel. So they tuned their personal shields to harden against rapid kinetic force. It was a flawless defensive strategy. In a gunfight, the hegemony was invincible. But humans were a desperate improvisational species, and humanity had spent the last decade preparing for urban warfare, not sterile field battles. They had resurrected a very old concept and updated it for the stars. Project Cerberus. What is the status of the auxiliary units? Hayes asked. Davis hesitated. He looked up from the console, swallowing hard. The canines? They're on the line, Captain. But if we send them over the top into that fire, they aren't pets, Lieutenant. Hayes snapped, though the words tasted like bile in her mouth. She had a golden retriever back on Earth. She knew exactly what she was asking. They are military assets. And right now, they are the only assets we have that don't rely on high-velocity ballistics. Davis looked back at the screen. You want to charge them? I want to break the hegemony's algorithmic perfection, Hayes said, pointing to the rigid red lines on the map. They don't understand chaos. They don't understand close-quarters biological combat. They've eradicated all predators on their home worlds. They haven't fought hand-to-hand in 10,000 years. She paused, watching another green dot wink out on the display. Another soldier gone. Their shields stop bullets, Hayes said softly. Let's see if they stop teeth. She keyed the global command frequency. All handlers on the line. This is Captain Hayes. Her voice echoed in the earpieces of 200 soldiers huddled in the mud. She could hear the heavy breathing over the open combs, the rain, the distant whine of alien weapons charging. We cannot win a firefight. Their kinetic barriers are holding, but those barriers are calibrated for velocity, not mass. She took a deep breath. Prepare the auxiliaries for a breach assault. Combat stems authorized. Override the safety limiters. In the bunker, Davis closed his eyes. Overriding the limiters meant pumping the dogs full of synthetic adrenaline and pain inhibitors. It turned them into unstoppable juggernauts. It also meant a massive strain on their hearts. Half of them wouldn't survive the physiological stress of the charge, let alone the enemy fire. They expect us to stay in these trenches and die like rats, Hayes said. Trenches and die like rats, Hayes said, her voice dropping to a hard, cold register. Show them what happens when you corner a human. She stared at the red lines advancing on the holomap. Execute Order Cerberus. The command hit Briggs HUD like a physical blow. The words flashed in bright, unyielding red. Order Cerberus active. Release protocol initiated. Briggs stared at the words. His stomach twisted into a tight, hard knot. He looked down at Brutus. The dog was already reacting. The command had automatically triggered the medical dispensers built into his combat harness. A cocktail of combat stimulants, neural accelerators, and coagulants flooded the animal's bloodstream. Brutus let out a sharp, choked gasp. His massive chest heaved. The muscles underneath the titanium plating swelled, pulling the straps taut. His amber eyes dilated until they were almost entirely black. The low growl in his throat pitched up, becoming a terrifying, ragged snarl that sounded like tearing metal. The dog was no longer just a loyal companion. He was a biological weapon dialed up to a state of absolute frantic aggression. "Easy, boy," Briggs whispered, his voice trembling. He reached out with a shaking hand and gripped the heavy steel ring on Brutus's collar. "Hold on." Up on the ridge the hegemony appeared. They crested the hill in perfect unison. A solid wall of white armor, unbothered by the rain or the mud. They held their thermal lances at identical angles. Before them a faint, translucent blue shimmer rippled in the air. Their kinetic shields interlocked and unbreakable. They looked down at the human trenches. They didn't pause. They didn't seek cover. They simply began to march down the slope. Crack, crack. Human rifles opened up. Tracer rounds and railgun slugs slammed into the blue shimmer, flaring bright white before bouncing off into the mud. The hegemony didn't even flinch. They raised their lances. A beam of blinding yellow heat lashed out, striking a bunker 30 yards to Briggs's left. The concrete exploded into vapor, and the screams of the soldiers inside were cut short in a fraction of a second. "Wait," Briggs muttered, gripping the collar tighter. Brutus was thrashing now, his metal paws gouging deep trenches in the earth. The dog's entire body was a coiled spring, desperate to release. The biometric readings on Briggs's HUD were flashing critical. The dog's heart rate was through the roof. "Wait for it," Briggs yelled over the roaring rain and the sizzling of plasma. The white wall marched closer. 100 yards. 80 yards. 60. Briggs could see the smooth, featureless faceplates of their helmets. He could see the absolute lack of hesitation. They thought they were clearing pests. All handlers. A sergeant's voice screamed over the combs, panicked and raw. "Cut 'em loose." Briggs slammed his palm against the quick-release shackle. "Get 'em, Brutus." Briggs roared, his voice quacking. "Kill 'em." The heavy steel clasp snapped open. 300 genetically augmented, armor-plated hounds exploded out of the mud. The sound they made wasn't a bark. It was a collective, deafening roar of pure, unleashed predation. It echoed off the blasted hills, a primal sound that belonged to the dark forests of Earth long before civilization existed. Brutus hit the top of the trench and launched himself into the open ground. It was a blur of mud and gray titanium, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The hegemony soldiers paused. For the first time in the war, their perfect synchronization broke. Their internal targeting algorithms were expecting rigid, predictable human infantry, moving at standard speeds. They were not programmed to track quadrupedal masses of muscle moving close to the ground. At 45 miles per hour, Brutus reached the blue shimmer of the kinetic shield. A railgun slug moving at Mach 3 triggered the shield's hardening response, causing it to become an impenetrable wall. But Brutus, leaping through the air, was not moving at Mach 3. He was moving at 45 miles per hour. He passed right through the kinetic threshold. The shield didn't even spark. Brutus hit the first hegemony soldier center mass. 140 pounds of dog and 40 pounds of armor slammed into the alien's chest. The impact was brutal. The alien's white armor cracked under the localized force. The soldier was thrown backward, its thermal lance firing wildly into the sky. Brutus didn't stop. He scrambled up the alien's torso, his steel-capped paws finding purchase in the cracks he just made. The alien raised a sleek silver arm to push the beast away. It was a logical, calculated movement. It meant nothing to a dog. Brutus's jaws opened. His teeth, reinforced with titanium crowns, clamped down on the soft, unarmored joint between the alien's helmet and shoulder plating. He locked his jaw and viciously wrenched his head to the side. Black fluid sprayed across the white armor. The alien thrashed once, violently, and then went completely limp. All across the line, the scene repeated. The perfectly ordered phalanx of the hegemony dissolved into absolute carnage. Dogs were inside the shields. They were too close for the thermal lances. They were tearing at joints, crushing limbs, dragging the tall, elegant aliens down into the filthy mud. The air filled with the shrieks of tearing metal and the sudden, chaotic alarms of the hegemony's internal comms. The aliens tried to fall back. They tried to calculate a retreat. But there is no calculating the chaotic fury of a pack of wolves. Briggs vaulted out of the trench, his combat knife drawn, his empty rifle slung across his back. He screamed, a raw, primal yell that tore his throat, running into the fray behind his dog. He found Brutus standing over a second downed alien. The dog's armor slick with black blood, his chest heaving. An alien to the right raised its lance, aiming at the dog's flank. Briggs didn't hesitate. He tackled the alien, driving his heavy knee into its chest plate and burying his combat knife deep into the visor. The alien went still. Briggs scrambled up, gasping for air, the rain washing the black fluid from his visor. He looked around. The immaculate white line of the hegemony was shattered. Bodies lay broken in the mud. The survivors were actually retreating, their movements erratic, their sterile logic broken by the sudden, terrifying introduction of sheer brutality. Brutus trotted over to Briggs, his breathing labored, the stems beginning to wear off. The dog bumped his heavy, bloody snout against Briggs's hand. Briggs dropped to his knees in the mud. He wrapped his arms around the thick, armored neck of the hound, burying his face in the wet fur, not caring about the blood or the dirt. He felt the rapid, booming heartbeat of the dog against his own chest. They had held the line. The rain finally stopped, leaving behind a silence that was worse than the deafening roar of artillery. It was the silence of a butcher's floor after the work was done. Corporal Thomas Briggs sat on an overturned crate, his hands shaking as he held a canteen. The water tasted like iodine and tin. He took a sip, swished it around his teeth to clear the grit, and spat it onto the scorched earth. A few feet away, Brutus lay on his side. The massive hound was breathing in shallow, ragged hitches. The chemical cocktail of the combat stems was leaching out of his system, leaving behind a profound, crushing exhaustion. A medic had managed to patch a jagged laceration along the dog's flank where a hegemony gauntlet had clipped him. The smell of singed fur and biofoam hung heavy in the damp air. Briggs reached into his utility pouch and pulled out a high-calorie protein bar. He tore the wrapper off with his teeth, broke the bar in half, and leaned down. "Here," Briggs rasped. Brutus didn't lift his head. He just opened his jaws slightly. Briggs placed the food on the dog's tongue. The animal chewed slowly, mechanically, his amber eyes half closed and dull. "We hurt them," a voice said. Briggs looked up. Sergeant Miller was walking down the trench line. He was missing his helmet, and a makeshift bandage was wrapped tightly around his forehead, stained dark red. Miller kicked a piece of shattered white hegemony armor. "We pushed them back a mile," Miller said, his voice flat. "First time in a month they've taken a step backward." "They aren't retreating," Briggs said, looking back at his dog. "They're defragmenting. They're running the numbers on what just happened." "Let them run their damn numbers," Miller spat. "They bleed black. We proved that." At a cost, a new voice chimed in. Private Carter slid down the muddy embankment, his face pale. Following closely behind him was Ripley, a lean, wired Belgian Malinois. Ripley's armor was dented, and she paced nervously, her claws clicking against the exposed rocks. 20 K9 units didn't make it back, Carter said, wiping a mixture of rain and sweat from his chin. Hearts gave out. Stems burned them up from the inside. Or they got too close to a plasma core when an alien ruptured. Briggs looked down at the mud. He knew the cost. He felt every spike in Brutus's heart rate through the neural link. He had felt the dog brushing against the edge of cardiac arrest. In the subterranean command bunker, Captain Sarah Hayes watched the tactical map with a sickening realization. The red dots of the hegemony had indeed pulled back, reforming their perfect geometric lines just beyond artillery range. But they weren't idle. "Lieutenant Davis," Hayes said. Her eyes locked on the holographic projection. "Give me a scan of their forward elements. What are they doing?" Davis's fingers flew across the console. "Interference is heavy, Captain. But they aren't bringing up more infantry. They are deploying something else. Heavy units. Treads, not bipedal." Hayes zoomed in on the projection. Blurry, massive shapes were moving to the front of the alien lines. They were wide, squat, and heavily armored. Unlike the sleek, elegant infantry, these machines looked utilitarian, brutal. These machines looked utilitarian, brutal. "They don't have emotions, Captain," Davis murmured, reading the telemetry. "They didn't pull back out of fear. They pulled back because their infantry was statistically inefficient against our new tactic. They found a patch for our exploit." Hayes said coldly. She keyed the comms. "All forward units, be advised. The enemy is changing deployment. Heavy armor moving to the front. We still have 5,000 civilians boarding the last 3 dropships. You need to buy me 2 more hours." Down in the trench, Briggs heard the order. He looked at Brutus. The dog was finally asleep, his heavy head resting on his front paws. 2 hours. Carter muttered, looking at Ripley. "They're barely standing. They don't have to stand," Briggs said, standing up and grabbing his rifle. He checked the battery gauge, still in the red. "They just have to keep the enemy looking down." He walked over to Brutus and knelt in the mud. He placed a hand on the dog's armored shoulder. "Wake up, buddy," Briggs whispered. Brutus opened his eyes. He didn't whine. He didn't complain. He just looked at Briggs, let out a long breath, and hauled himself to his feet. The metal joints of his armor groaned. They were dogs. They didn't understand the tactical situation. They didn't know about the dropships, the civilians, or the extinction of the human race. They only knew that their humans were still in danger, and there was work to do. The ground didn't shake this time. It vibrated. A low, continuous hum that rattled the teeth in Briggs's skull. The human line had moved up, taking positions in a ruined industrial complex at the edge of the valley. Rusted girders and shattered concrete provided better cover than the mud trenches. Briggs crouched behind a collapsed retaining wall, peering through the scope of his rifle. "Here they come," Miller whispered beside him. The hegemony advanced, but the white infantry were trailing behind. Leading the charge were the new machines. They were the size of small tanks hovering 3 feet off the ground on repulsor lifts. They had no visible weapons, no plasma casters, no thermal lances, just a massive dish-like apparatus mounted on the front. "What the hell are those?" Carter asked, keeping Ripley close. The melanine Wah was already whining, her ears pinned flat against her skull. Briggs frowned. His HUD flashed a warning. "Anomalous frequency detected. Hold fire." Briggs ordered, "Wait until they are in range." The heavy machines crossed the valley floor. They didn't bother with kinetic shields. Their armor was thick, sloped composite, designed to deflect ballistics purely through geometry. When they were 200 yards out, the dishes powered up. There was no flash of light, no explosion. Briggs didn't hear anything at first, but Brutus reacted instantly. The massive Rottweiler mix slammed into the dirt, letting out a high-pitched, agonizing yelp. He pawed frantically at his titanium collar, his eyes wide with sudden, inexplicable terror. Down the line, the reaction was identical. 200 dogs collapsed, writhing, howling in pain, desperately trying to cover their ears. "Brutus!" Briggs yelled, dropping his rifle and grabbing the dog's harness. The animal was thrashing so violently he nearly knocked Briggs over. "My ears!" Carter screamed, dropping to his knees. Then it hit the humans, a sickening, piercing whine that bypassed the eardrums and vibrated directly inside the skull. It wasn't just sound. It was physical pressure. Nausea washed over Briggs in a violent wave. His vision blurred, doubling, then tripling. Vertigo slammed him into the concrete. The hegemony had analyzed the battlefield. They recognized that humanity's advantage relied on biological assets with highly sensitive auditory and olfactory systems. So they deployed localized high-intensity sonic emitters. A localized frequency designed to rupture the inner ear of a canine and disorient a human. Pure, cold calculus. "They're jamming us out," Miller shouted, vomiting over the side of his cover. We can't move." Behind the sonic tanks, the white infantry began their advance. They moved with impunity now. The dogs were completely incapacitated, rolling in the dirt, trapped in a sensory hell. The humans were pinned, unable to aim, barely able to stand. "Command, we are getting ripped apart by sonic weaponry." Briggs screamed into his combs, grabbing Brutus by the heavy collar and trying to drag the massive animal behind a thicker piece of concrete. "The dogs are down. I repeat, Cerberus units are completely ineffective." In the bunker, Hayes watched the biometric feeds of the K-9 units turn critical. Their heart rates were spiking again, not from stems, but from pure panic and pain. "Captain," Davis said, his voice tight, "the sonic field is absolute. It's creating a wall of pressure. Our infantry can't fire accurately. The K-9 South are paralyzed." Hayes slammed her fist against the tactical table. The hegemony was suffocating them without firing a single plasma bolt. "Target those emitters," Hayes ordered. "Hit them with everything we have left." Rail guns, rockets, whatever isn't melted. They're too heavily armored, Davis replied, pulling up the telemetry. Our ballistics are bouncing off the sloped chassis. The emitters are recessed behind kinetic baffles. Hayes watched the red dots close in on the green. The green dots were stationary, dying. There's a blind spot, Davis suddenly said, his fingers moving frantically. The sonic field is directional. It's a cone projecting forward, directly underneath and behind the emitter tanks. The frequency is a fraction of the intensity. How close do you have to be? Right under the chassis, Davis said. Point-blank range. Hayes closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She opened them, her face hardened into stone. Briggs. Hayes's voice cut through the static in Briggs's earpiece. The sonic fields are directional. You have to get under those tanks to disable them. Explosives to the undercarriage. Briggs was pressed flat against the ground, his hands clamped over his ears, blood trickling from his left nostril. Are you out of your mind? Briggs grunted. We can't even stand up. The dogs are losing their minds. You have 70 pounds of high-yield C4 in your squad's demolitions kit. Hayes said. The coldness in her voice was absolute. The dropships are fueled. They launch in 20 minutes. If those emitters crest your position, the hegemony anti-air batteries will have a clear shot at the ascending ships. 20,000 people, Briggs. Briggs looked at the tactical display on his visor. It was flickering, distorted by the sonic waves, but he could see the timers. He looked at Brutus. The dog was huddled against the concrete, his amber eyes squeezed shut, drool pooling at his jaws. You don't need to stand. Hayes's voice whispered in his ear. You just need to crawl. The sonic pressure felt like a physical weight pressing down on Briggs's spine. Every movement required a monumental effort of will. Carter. Briggs yelled over the localized frequency, crawling through the mud toward the young private. Ripley was curled into a tight ball, trembling violently. Carter looked up, his eyes bloodshot. A thin line of vomit on his chin. Grab the charges. Briggs ordered, pointing to the dead demolitions expert a few yards away. We're going under the tanks. Carter stared at him like he was insane. We can't. Ripley, leave the dogs, Briggs barked. It was the hardest order he had ever given. They can't handle the frequency. Tie them off. Now. Briggs unclipped the heavy leash from his belt and snapped it onto the reinforced rebar of the concrete slab. He attached the other end to Brutus's collar. Stay, Briggs commanded. His voice broke. Brutus opened his eyes. Despite the agonizing pain, despite the sensory overload, the dog tried to stand. He tried to follow. Briggs pushed him back down, his hand resting heavily on the armored skull. Stay, Brutus. Stay down. Briggs grabbed 3 bricks of C4 from the demo kit. He slapped detonators into the soft plastic explosive and jammed them into his chest rig. Carter did the same, his hands shaking violently. He tied Ripley to a steel girder. The Malinois whimpered, a heartbreaking sound that cut through the mechanical whine of the alien weapons. Let's go, Briggs said. They didn't run. They couldn't. They belly crawled through the mud, pulling themselves forward with their elbows, keeping their profiles as low as possible. The sonic pressure wave passed over them, a physical ceiling of agony just inches above their heads. The ground vibrated as the massive hover tanks approached. "Keep your head down," Briggs yelled, spitting a mouthful of sludge. Above them, the white infantry of the hegemony advanced, their thermal lances sweeping the ruins, executing any human soldier who tried to stand. Briggs and Carter moved like ghosts in the dirt. The closer they got to the emitters, the worse the nausea became. Briggs' vision swam in a sea of gray and purple. His muscles cramped. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to curl up, to surrender to the noise. 20,000 people. He kept crawling. 50 yards, 30 yards. The lead tank loomed ahead, a massive gray slab of metal hovering over the broken earth. The sonic dish on its front hummed with terrifying power. "Carter, take the left one." Briggs shouted, his voice barely audible over the vibration. "I'm taking the right." Carter nodded once, his face pale as death, and broke off, dragging himself through a shallow trench toward the second tank. Briggs reached the shadow of the lead tank. The moment he slipped beneath the sloped front armor, the pressure vanished. The silence was sudden, shocking, and absolute. Davis was right. The cone of sound projected outward, directly underneath the repulsor lifts. It was a dead zone. Briggs gasped for air, his chest heaving. He rolled onto his back, looking up at the smooth metallic underbelly of the machine. The air smelled intensely of ozone and superheated copper. He pulled a brick of C4 from his rig. He peeled the adhesive backing off and slapped it directly onto the glowing blue casing of the repulsor engine. He set the timer for 10 seconds. Command: charge planted on lead unit. Briggs gasped into his comms. "Copy that, Briggs." "Get clear." Haze sounded miles away. Briggs scrambled out from under the tank, throwing himself back into the mud, bracing for the sonic wave to hit him again. It hit him like a hammer. He squeezed his eyes shut and counted. 3, 2, 1. The explosion was muted by the sonic field, but the kinetic force was undeniable. The C4 ripped through the repulsor engine. The massive tank shuddered, listed violently to the right, and slammed into the earth. The humming of the sonic dish died instantly, with a dying metallic screech. The pressure lifted. Briggs inhaled a massive breath of cold, muddy air. He could hear the rain again. He could hear gunfire. "Carter!" Briggs yelled, looking to his left. The second tank was still hovering. It hadn't detonated. Briggs dragged himself up to his knees. He saw Carter. The young private was lying halfway out from under the second tank. A hegemony soldier, flanked by the heavy machine, stood over him. The alien raised its thermal lance. Carter didn't have the explosives planted. He was holding his chest, blood pouring from a wound. No. Briggs screamed, raising his empty rifle, a useless gesture. Before the alien could fire, a blur of gray metal and teeth launched from the ruins. Ripley, the Malinois, hadn't stayed. She had chewed through her heavy nylon tactical leash. The moment the first sonic tank went down, relieving the pressure on the ruins, the dog had tracked her handler. She hit the alien soldier square in the chest, her jaws locking onto the smooth white armor of the helmet. The impact knocked the alien backward, the thermal lance discharging harmlessly into the sky. But Ripley was a lighter breed. She wasn't armored like Brutus. The alien recovered quickly. It grabbed Ripley by the throat, its mechanized gauntlet crushing inward. The dog gagged, her claws scrabbling uselessly against the white plating. The alien threw the dog against the side of the hovering tank. Ripley hit the metal with a sickening crack and dropped to the mud, motionless. "Ripley!" Carter screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. The alien turned back to Carter, raising the lance again. A heavy, low growl echoed across the battlefield. It wasn't the frantic, stim-fueled snarl from before. It was slow, deep, murderous. Brutus stepped out of the ruins. He had snapped the steel rebar entirely in half. He walked slowly, his head low, his amber eyes locked entirely on the white armor of the alien that had just struck down his packmate. The hegemony soldier calculated the threat. It leveled the lance at the massive Rottweiler mix. Brutus didn't charge. He exploded. He closed the distance in 3 massive bounds. The alien fired. A beam of superheated plasma scored across Brutus's left shoulder, melting the titanium plating and searing the flesh beneath. Brutus didn't make a sound. He didn't slow down. He didn't register the pain. He hit the alien with the force of a freight train. He didn't go for the throat. He hit the knees. 140 pounds of muscle crashed into the bipedal joints, snapping them backward with a horrific crunch. The alien fell. Brutus was on top of it in a microsecond. He bypassed the armor entirely. He clamped his immense jaws onto the weapon arm, the titanium-crowned teeth biting clean through the composite plating and into the synthetic bone beneath. He wrenched his neck violently. The arm separated from the shoulder in a spray of black fluid. The alien thrashed, reaching for a sidearm. Brutus dropped the severed limb, lunged forward, and crushed the alien's featureless visor between his jaws. The machine went limp. Brutus stood over the body, blood dripping from his jaws. He turned his heavy head toward the second tank, ignoring the burning wound on his shoulder. He looked at Carter, who was frantically pulling himself under the chassis. "Briggs!" Carter yelled, slapping the C4 onto the underside of the tank. 10 seconds. Brutus didn't move. He stood over Carter, placing himself directly between the exposed handler and the advancing line of hegemony infantry. "Brutus, come!" Briggs screamed, finally finding his feet and sprinting across the mud. "Here, boy, here." Brutus looked at Briggs. His amber eyes were calm. The stems were gone. The frenzy was gone. There was only the singular, unbreakable instinct to protect. He didn't run to Briggs. He took 2 steps forward toward the advancing aliens and let out a deafening, challenging roar. The explosion tore the second tank apart. The shock wave threw Briggs off his feet, sending him face first into the sludge. Metal shrapnel rained down like hail, tearing through the air, embedding itself in the mud and the ruins. The sonic pressure vanished completely. Briggs pushed himself up, his ears ringing, his vision swimming. The sky above them suddenly lit up. 3 massive pillars of blue fire pierced the bruised clouds. The dropships. They were away. They were safe. Briggs wiped the mud from his visor and looked toward the crater where the second tank had been. The tank was a burning ruin of twisted metal. The advancing line of hegemony infantry had been shredded by the shrapnel. Carter was sitting up, coughing violently, covered in dirt and oil but alive. Briggs scanned the area. His heart stopped. "Brutus," Briggs whispered. He found the dog lying 30 feet away near the shattered remains of the alien he had killed. The blast had thrown him. His armor was cracked and blackened. The wound on his shoulder was severe. Briggs dropped to his knees, sliding the last few feet through the mud. He pulled the heavy armored head into his lap. "Brutus," Briggs pleaded, his voice breaking, tears finally mixing with the rain and the blood on his face. He frantically checked the biometric readouts on his HUD. The dog's breathing was shallow. Blood pooled at the corner of his mouth, but he opened his eyes. He looked up at Briggs. He let out a soft, low whine, and his thick tail gave a weak, single thump against the ground. Briggs buried his face in the dog's neck, wrapping his arms around the massive, broken body. He didn't care about the advancing army. He didn't care about the war. Above them, the drop ships broke the atmosphere, carrying the remnants of a battered species into the stars. They had survived. They had broken the perfect calculus of an invincible armada, and they hadn't done it with better guns or thicker armor or colder logic. They had done it with mud and blood and the unbreakable, terrifying love of a dog. The sky above Jericho didn't clear when the drop ships breached the atmosphere. The bruised purple clouds simply swallowed the blue exhaust trails, leaving behind a sky that looked like a fresh corpse. Down in the mud, there was no cheering. Corporal Thomas Briggs sat in the bottom of a waterlogged crater, holding a pressure dressing against Brutus's scorched shoulder. The plasma blast had melted the titanium plating directly into the dog's flesh. The smell of burned meat and synthetic ozone made Briggs' empty stomach heave, but he didn't look away. He kept his hands steady, applying constant crushing pressure. "Hold on, buddy," Briggs whispered. His voice was entirely gone, reduced to a dry rasp. "Just hold on." Brutus was conscious. His massive chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow jerks. He didn't whine. He just watched Briggs with wide, pain-clouded amber eyes, occasionally licking his own nose to clear the falling ash. Around them, the shattered remnants of Echo Squad were picking themselves up from the sludge. There were no high fives. There was no relief. The dropships had taken the civilians and the Corps command staff. The rear guard, the 200 men, women, and K-9 South who had held the line were officially marooned. "Medic!" Briggs finally screamed, the word tearing at his throat. "I need a medic over here." A figure detached itself from the gloom. It was Doc Jensen, a combat surgeon whose white armor was stained entirely gray. He slid down the edge of the crater, his medical kit clattering against his hip. Jensen didn't waste time with pleasantries. He dropped to his knees, snapped a pair of latex gloves over his filthy hands, and looked at the wound. "It's a clean cauterization, but the heat transferred, boiled the tissue underneath." Jensen muttered, his eyes scanning the biometric readout on Brutus's collar. "Heart rate is 220. He's in shock. Fix him," Briggs demanded. Jensen shot Briggs a hard look. "I have 3 humans bleeding out from shrapnel in the next trench, Corporal. I'm low on biofoam. I'm out of morphine." Briggs reached down to his own thigh pouch. He pulled out a standard-issue auto-injector of human-grade painkillers. He shoved it into Jensen's chest. "Take mine," Briggs said. His voice was dead, devoid of any negotiation. "Fix," snorts the dog. Jensen looked at the injector, then at Briggs, and finally down at Brutus. The dog's tail gave a microscopic involuntary thump against the mud. Jensen sighed, a sound heavier than the rain. "Hold him down," Jensen ordered. For the next 10 minutes, Briggs pinned the 140 lb animal to the earth, while Jensen cut away the melted titanium and sprayed freezing biofoam into the ragged wound. Brutus snorts, convulsed once, a massive spasm of agony, and then his head slumped into the mud. "He's out," Jensen said, wiping his forearm across his brow. "The foam will stop the necrosis, but he can't fight, Briggs. If that shoulder tears open again, he'll bleed out in minutes. He doesn't have to fight," Briggs said softly, stroking the dog's unbroken ear. "He did his job." A mile away, in the subterranean command bunker, the situation was equally grim. Captain Sarah Hayes hadn't boarded the dropships. She stood over the flickering tactical table, watching the red dots of the hegemony slowly begin to reorganize. The alien Armada hadn't been defeated. They had simply been paused. Lieutenant Davis sat at his console, his head in his hands. The bunker was running on auxiliary battery power. The air scrubbers were offline, and the room already smelled of stale sweat and electrical fires. "Status of the hegemony forces?" Hayes asked. Davis rubbed his eyes and looked at the screen. They'd pulled back to a 5-click perimeter. "They're running a perimeter sweep, not advancing, just sitting there." "They're defragmenting," Hayes said, leaning over the table. "We introduced a variable they couldn't process: chaos, biological unpredictability. They lost 2 of their sonic emitters and a heavy infantry company to a biological asset they classified as non-threatening." "So, they're updating their software," Davis said bitterly. "Writing a patch for dogs?" "Exactly," Hayes said, "which means they will return. And when they do, they won't make the same mistake. They'll deploy area denial weapons, gas, radiation. They won't engage in close quarters." Hayes keyed the global comms. "All surviving units, this is Captain Hayes. The evacuation was successful. You bought 20,000 people a second chance at life, but nobody is coming back for us." She let the reality hang in the air for a moment. She owed them the truth. "We cannot hold this static line. The hegemony is recalibrating. If we stay in these trenches, they will glass us from orbit or gas us in the mud. We are snorts abandoning the forward operating base. Break down into fire teams. Take every scrap of food, every battery, and every K9 unit. We are moving into the ruins of Jericho City." Down in the mud, Sergeant Miller was leaning against a concrete pylon, wrapping a fresh bandage around his head. He looked at the smoking skyline of the ruined human colony behind them. "Urban warfare," Miller muttered. "We're going to be rats in the walls. Better a live rat than a dead hero," Private Carter said. He was sitting cross-legged in the dirt, cradling Ripley. The lean Malinois had survived the impact with the tank, but 3 of her ribs were shattered. Carter had strapped her into a makeshift sling made from a torn tactical vest. Briggs hauled himself to his feet. His muscles screamed in protest. He looked down at Brutus. The dog was breathing easier now, the painkillers pulling him into a deep chemical sleep. Briggs unclipped his webbing and fashioned a heavy drag litter out of an alien, kinetic shield baffle, and 2 lengths of nylon rope. He rolled the massive dog onto the makeshift sled. "Let's move out," Briggs said, grabbing the ropes. Before they finished their math, 3 months of rain had dissolved the ash into a permanent toxic sleet. Jericho City was a graveyard of steel and glass, its skyscrapers reduced to jagged teeth gnawing at a bruised sky. Down in the streets, the carcasses of ground cars and the skeletal remains of the initial invasion rusted in the acidic downpour. Humanity no longer held trenches. They held the shadows. Briggs lay flat against the cracked tile of a ruined third-floor apartment. His right eye was pressed against the optic of a scavenged thermal lance. Beside him, Brutus was perfectly still. The hound was a fraction of his former size. His ribs showed through his matted, filthy coat. The plasma burn on his shoulder had healed into a grotesque knot of twisted pink tissue. He didn't wear heavy titanium armor anymore. It clattered too much in the silent city. Instead, he wore a lightweight harness woven from seat belts and Kevlar. And he wore the cowl. After the sonic tanks nearly broke the hounds, resistance engineers stripped kinetic baffles from dead hegemony infantry, welding the alien metal into heavy, sound-canceling helmets for the canines. Brutus's upper skull and ears were entirely encased in matte black soundproofing. He looked less like a dog and more like a gargoyle. He didn't need his ears. The hegemony's synthetic coolant smelled like rotting pennies. Brutus's nostrils flared. He drew in the damp air, his chest barely expanding, and nudged Briggs's elbow with a wet snout. Target. Briggs adjusted the optic. Down on Fifth Avenue, a hegemony patrol picked its way through the rubble. 5 bipedal soldiers in immaculate white composite armor. But they didn't march in perfect, arrogant lines anymore. They moved in a staggered diamond formation, checking rooftops and sweeping the alleys. Their internal algorithms had updated. They had learned that the dark had teeth. 5 tangos, Briggs whispered into his throat mic. His voice was a rasp of gravel. Entering the kill zone. Anvil is set, Sergeant Miller's voice crackled back over the encrypted channel. Bring the hammer. Briggs traced the edge of Brutus's cowl. Go. Brutus slithered backward from the window, his padded paws silent against the broken glass. He vanished down the darkened stairwell. Briggs tracked the patrol. They reached an intersection, and the lead alien paused, raising a localized seismic scanner to sweep the asphalt for human tunneling vibrations. From the hollowed-out shell of a ruined bank to their left, a gray blur launched into the sleet. Brutus hit the trailing alien from behind, his mass driving the machine forward to prevent a backward fall. His titanium-crowned teeth bypassed the impenetrable white armor, clamping violently onto the ribbed tubing that fed the alien's respiratory suite at the base of its neck. The dog threw his weight into a brutal twist. The snort's tubing snapped with a hiss of escaping gas. Using his own momentum, Brutus dragged the convulsing alien backward into the absolute darkness of the bank. It took exactly 2 seconds. The remaining 4 aliens stopped dead. Their squad telemetry registered the sudden termination of a node. They spun around, featureless visors scanning the bank, lances raising. They were looking at the wrong threat. Crack, snorts. From a rooftop 2 blocks down, Miller fired his heavy magnetic accelerator. The Mach 3 railgun slug would just bounce off their kinetic shields, so he didn't aim at them. He aimed at the cracked pavement directly beneath their feet. The tungsten hit the earth like a localized meteor strike. Jagged chunks of concrete and pulverized rock exploded upward. Because the heavy shrapnel moved below the shield's high-velocity threshold, it passed right through the blue shimmer. 2 aliens collapsed, their perfect armor shattered at the knees, leaking black fluid into the rain. The remaining 2 instantly calculated a firing solution on Miller's rooftop. They didn't get the chance to fire. A rusted storm drain cover beneath them blew open. Private Carter erupted from the sewer. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He held a length of sharpened steel rebar wrapped in duct tape. He drove the spike violently upward, slipping it cleanly under the chin plate of the nearest alien, severing its central processing core. The last alien swung its lance toward Carter. Ripley was faster. The Belgian Malinois shot out of the drain, right behind her handler. She clamped her jaws onto the alien's weapon arm, her momentum dragging the heavy thermal lance downward. It discharged harmlessly, vaporizing a puddle of dirty water instead of Carter's chest. Carter ripped his spike free, pivoted, and buried it into the final alien's chest cavity. The intersection fell utterly silent. Briggs jogged down the fire escape, boots crunching softly on the rubble. When he reached the street, Carter was already on his knees, brutally ripping the power cords from the dead machines. Brutus trotted out of the ruined bank, dragging a featureless white helmet, and dropped it at Briggs's feet with a wheezing breath. "Clean," Miller said, dropping lightly from a fire escape ladder. "No distress signal." "Take the batteries," Briggs ordered. "Leave the armor. Let the next patrol find them naked." They were the Ghost Pack. The hegemony had categorized them as a systemic threat. The aliens had tried flooding the subways with neurotoxins, but the dogs smelled the chemical shift hours before it reached lethal density. The aliens were perfectly logical, and when logic continually fails, the resulting algorithmic shift looks exactly like fear. Briggs's earpiece crackled violently. "Briggs," Captain Hayes said, from the subterranean command bunker. Her voice was uncharacteristically tight. "Telemetry from the scavenged radar array just spiked. The Armada isn't maintaining blockade orbit anymore. They are clustering directly over Jericho City. They are bringing heavy dreadnoughts into the lower atmosphere." Briggs looked up at the weeping sky. "Are they deploying more heavy armor?" "No," Hayes replied. "The word heavy is lead. They are going to glass the grid. They can't eradicate us on the ground, so they are melting the city down to the bedrock." Carter stopped looting, his pale face streaked with dirt. "Glass it. The civilians in Sub-4 won't survive." Hayes finished for him. "The thermal penetration of a dreadnought strike will turn the subway tunnels into ovens. There is nowhere to run." Brutus whined, a low vibration felt more than heard, sensing the sudden spike in human cortisol. "How long until they fire?" Briggs asked. His voice was dead flat. 12 hours to cycle the main cannons." Briggs looked at the dead aliens, remembering the tactical databanks. "They won't blind fire through this cloud cover. It violates their safety protocols. They need the orbital targeting beacon to paint the city." "Sector 7, Miller said, his eyes widening. "The World Bank building. They turned it into their command spire. If we kill the spire, we blind the ships," Briggs said. "It's suicide," Hayes warned. "That spire is guarded by 3 companies of heavy infantry and a dozen sonic tanks. You can't get close." Briggs looked down at Brutus. The dog looked back, amber eyes calm and ready. "We don't need to survive," Briggs said. "We just need to break the glass." The World Bank building was no longer a structure of glass and steel. The hegemony had coated it in a smooth, frictionless white composite, turning it into a towering obelisk that pierced the low-hanging clouds. At its base, a sprawling plaza was heavily fortified. Dozens of sonic tanks hovered silently on patrol routes. Hundreds of white armored infantry stood in perfect immobile formations, guarding the central targeting spire that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic blue light. Briggs crouched behind the rusted chassis of a city bus 300 yards away. He wasn't alone. Behind him, filling the ruined streets and alleyways, were the remnants of the human military. 200 human soldiers wrapped in rags and scavenged armor, and 50 hounds. "This is it," Briggs whispered into the comms. "All units, we don't need to kill them all. We just need to break the spire. Focus all heavy fire on the central obelisk. We won't get close," Miller said, peering through a cracked pair of binoculars. "Their kinetic shields are interlocked. It's a solid wall. Then we break the wall," Briggs said. He reached down and removed the heavy acoustic cowl from Brutus' head. The dog shook his head, his ears snapping up, immediately swiveling to pick up the myriad sounds of the battlefield. The hum of the tanks, the whine of the plasma weapons. "I'm sorry, buddy," Briggs whispered, kissing the top of the dog's scarred head. "We need your ears for this." Briggs stood up. He stepped out from behind the bus. The hegemony sensors instantly locked onto him. A dozen thermal lances raised in unison. "Command," Briggs said, his voice echoing across the silent plaza. Now, a mile away in the subterranean bunker, Captain Hayes initiated the sequence. The resistance had spent 3 months wiring the subterranean gas mains and sewage lines beneath Sector 7 with every ounce of scavenged C4, alien plasma cells, and raw fertilizer they could find. The ground didn't shake. It ruptured. The entire plaza beneath the hegemony fortress detonated in a synchronized cataclysmic explosion. Massive slabs of concrete weighing thousands of tons were thrown into the air. The perfect interlocked kinetic shields of the alien infantry flared brilliantly, trying to deflect the kinetic force of a city block exploding upward. The shields held against the shrapnel. They didn't hold against gravity. The ground fell away beneath the aliens. Tanks tumbled into the massive fiery sinkhole. Infantry formations dissolved into chaos as the earth was swallowed. "Push!" Briggs roared. The ghost pack surged forward. They didn't charge in a straight line. They moved through the dust and falling debris like a pack of wolves cutting out a sick elk. The dogs led the way. Without the sonic tanks, which were currently crushed at the bottom of the sinkhole, the hounds were unleashed. Brutus launched himself over a jagged slab of concrete, tearing into a disoriented hegemony soldier before it could regain its footing. He crushed the alien's visor and immediately bounced to the next target, never staying still long enough for a targeting algorithm to lock on. Briggs fired his scavenged thermal lance, melting through the armor of an alien trying to climb out of the crater. The human wave hit the disorganized aliens with brutal, messy efficiency. Knives, rebar, scavenged alien weapons, and titanium-crowned teeth turned the plaza into a slaughterhouse. They carved a path directly toward the pulsing blue targeting spire at the center of the obelisk. "Miller, the charges!" Briggs yelled over the roar of plasma fire. Miller sprinted through the gap the dogs had created, hauling a heavy canvas bag. He reached the base of the obelisk and began frantically slapping shape charges onto the smooth white composite. Above them, the clouds began to glow a brilliant, terrifying white. The dreadnoughts were fully charged. They were waiting for the signal. 10 seconds. Miller screamed, arming the detonator. An alien heavy infantry unit, twice the size of the standard soldiers, rose from the dust. It didn't have a lance. It had a massive rotary plasma cannon. It aimed directly at Miller. Briggs was out of position. He couldn't get a shot. Brutus saw the threat. The dog didn't hesitate. He abandoned his current target and sprinted across the open ground. He didn't try to bite the heavy infantry. He just threw his entire mass directly into the alien's knees. The impact misaligned the plasma cannon just as it fired. A beam of blinding energy scorched the air inches above Miller's head, melting the face of the obelisk instead. The heavy alien backhanded Brutus. The blow caught the dog in the ribs, sending him flying 30 feet through the air. Brutus hit the pavement with a sickening crunch and didn't get up. "No," Briggs screamed. Miller hit the detonator. The shaped charges blew inward, shattering the white composite armor of the obelisk. The internal blue light of the targeting spire flickered, sparked violently, and then died. A profound, suffocating darkness fell over the plaza. Above them, the glowing white clouds began to dim. Without a target lock, the safety protocols of the hegemony dreadnoughts overrode their firing sequence. The orbital strike was aborted. The surviving aliens in the plaza froze. Their central command node was gone. Their tactical network was shattered. They were blind, deaf, and cut off from the Armada. The human soldiers didn't freeze. They finished the job. Briggs didn't watch the slaughter. He dropped his weapon and ran across the ruined plaza, falling to his knees beside Brutus. The dog was breathing, but it was wet and labored. Blood trickled from his nose. His ribs were visibly caved in on the left side. Briggs tore his gloves off and placed his bare hands on the dog's chest. "Doc Jensen, get up here." He didn't know if Jensen was alive. He didn't care. He leaned over, resting his forehead against Brutus's bloodied muzzle. "You did it, buddy." Briggs sobbed, the tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "You did it. Just stay with me." Brutus opened his eyes. They were dull, losing focus, but he looked at Briggs. He let out a soft, rattling sigh and pushed his wet nose against Briggs's cheek. Suddenly the ground began to vibrate. It wasn't a sonic tank. It wasn't an explosion. It was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to tear the sky in half. Briggs looked up. Breaking through the low-hanging clouds weren't the elegant silver dreadnoughts of the hegemony. They were ugly. They were blocky. They were trailing black exhaust and re-entry fire. They were human drop cruisers. The fleet hadn't just run away. They had regrouped with the inner colonies. They had retooled, rearmed, and come back. The sky filled with the streaks of drop pods raining down on the city. Massive armored mechs and fresh marine battalions slammed into the earth, shaking the ruins to their foundations. The cavalry had arrived. A drop pod crashed into the plaza 50 yards away. The explosive bolts blew the doors off, and a squad of pristine, heavily armed Marines stepped out. They raised their weapons, scanning for the enemy. They froze. They didn't find an enemy stronghold. They found a graveyard of white armor. They found 200 starved, ragged ghosts standing among the ruins, holding knives and scavenged rifles. And they found the hounds sitting quietly among the bodies of the invaders. A Marine medic sprinted over to Briggs. He took one look at Brutus, pulled a heavy trauma kit from his back, and shoved Briggs aside. "I got him, Corporal," the medic said, his hands moving with practiced, frantic speed. "We have a medevac shuttle inbound. We got him." Briggs sat back on his heels. The rain finally stopped. Sunlight, harsh and bright, broke through the clouds for the first time in months, illuminating the glassed ruins of Jericho. He watched the medic work. He watched the fresh troops pour into the city, hunting down the remnants of the broken hegemony Armada. They came from the dark expecting easy prey. They expected our frailty, our fear, and our primitive ballistics. They learned that humanity doesn't fight alone. They learned that long before we conquered the stars, we conquered the wolves, and we brought them with us. The hegemony learned a brutal lesson in the dirt of Jericho. Humanity doesn't fight alone. We survived the dark not with cold logic or superior shielding, but with mud, blood, and the terrifying unbreakable loyalty of our best friends. We brought the wolves with us to the stars, and when the time came, we took them off the leash. If this tale of grit and the ultimate bond between species made your blood pump, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories from the front line, and share this video with someone who knows the true value of a loyal hound. Stay in the fight.